With this lecture, we will be beginning our discussion of the pre-Socratic philosophers, as they are known, who are a very diverse group of philosophers. They are regarded as the beginning of philosophy and science in Western thought. As the introduction to our text here, which we'll be using, which is the ancient Greek philosophy, Thales to Aristotle. As this introduction to the text points out, there's a marked difference between the style of thought represented in the pre-Socratics and that of such famous Greek poets as Hesiod and Homer. The poets rely on imaginative associations and stories about the gods in order to explain nature. And you see some examples of this in the introduction. For example, on page 2 from Hesiod's Theogony, he begins by calling upon the muses in order to enlighten him and to tell him things. He says, Hesiod now quoting here from page 2, "Tell me these things, muses who dwell on Olympus, from all beginning, and tell me which of them was born first. First of all, chaos came into being. Next came broad-breasted Gaia, or Earth, the secure dwelling place forever of all the immortals who hold the peak of snowy Olympus, and murky Tartaros, the underworld, in a recess of the broad-roaded earth, and Eros, love, who is the most beautiful among the immortal gods, who loosens the limbs and overpowers the intentions and sensible plans of all the gods and all the humans too." So you see here this origin story that's going to rely, first of all, on divine revelation, in this case, the revelation of the muses, the goddesses, who were understood to impart a kind of revelatory, mystical knowledge to the poet who called upon them, if the poet was favored by these goddesses, of course. So there's that authority, and then the way that things are expressed is in terms of these anthropomorphisms, where earth is equated with a god or a goddess, and we're led to understand that the beginning of things was due to motives that are similar to human motivations. So poets are relying on these kinds of imaginative associations and stories in order to explain nature. By contrast, the pre-Socratics eschew such stories, or else they're pushed to the margins or used mostly as ornamentation. You still see a residue of it, especially in the more poetically inclined philosophers, which includes Plato, as you will see. Now, the birth of philosophy is a fascinating topic because it raises fundamental questions about the distinction between philosophy and other human activities, especially art and religion. For example, the question, exactly how sharp is this boundary? Is there a decisive break and even an opposition between philosophy on the one hand and art, especially poetry, and religion more generally on the other hand? Also, it raises questions about the relationship between historical or material conditions and the rise of philosophy. As early as at least Aristotle, questions were already being asked by reflective students of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Why did philosophy arise at this particular time and in this particular place? And what did this birth really consist of? We see the remark in the introduction that Thales is regarded as the first philosopher because he predicted an eclipse. But that actually is not a particularly philosophical act. In fact, being able to predict heavenly events was a practice of prior civilizations that had well-developed traditions of astrology, and being able to predict events like eclipses wasn't something that was unknown, and certainly wasn't something that was distinctive of what philosophy later came to be understood to be. We don't go around predicting eclipses. That's a different branch of the university, right? However, what this seemed to indicate, though, is that there was something almost like a spark of the divine in Thales, that he was in a certain way touched by the gods in that he was able to give birth to something new. So what was this? Before I go on to make some remarks about this, and you see remarks in the introduction here as well, gives a good account of how we might understand this difference. It's important to remember that we're talking here about a birth of philosophy, one birth of philosophy. There were at least two other major world historical births of philosophy in India and China that occurred, of course, under different conditions independently of this. And so if we wanted to have a complete answer to the question of why philosophy is born in the particular time and place it is, we would have to include, of course, those civilizations as well, at least. So with that caveat in place, what is the distinction between philosophy and, say, mythology? Well, some distinctions that we might point out are, first of all, a speculative, inquiring, and critical attitude towards nature. So keep track of this. Distinctive of philosophy. Concerns its attitude towards nature, which is speculative, inquiring, and critical. A speculative, inquiring, critical attitude to nature, as opposed to what? Well, a speculative, I will say, as opposed to a reverent attitude, an attitude that worships nature as Gaia, as Mother Earth, to be revered, perhaps even to be worshipped, and not to be speculated about. That would be considered, from a certain perspective, as a kind of impiety, to speculate about the origin of something that is beyond you. Also, inquiring as opposed to accepting. Why are there earthquakes? Well, don't ask, just accept. That's just the way it is. The gods decided to create an earthquake. The philosophical attitude and the scientific attitude is, no, we want to understand what are the conditions under which this earthquake occurred in such a way as perhaps that we could, control them if possible, or at least anticipate or predict them. And so we'll see some of the answers, of course, to this kind of question that the pre-Socratic philosophers give strike us today as kind of absurd and weird, if not ridiculous, like earthquakes are caused by, the saturation of the soil or by heavy rains or something like that. But at least you can see the difference in the attitude, even if the answers that they gave weren't necessarily what we would consider to be correct today. Still, there is this fundamental shift from an accepting attitude towards natural phenomena to an inquiring attitude. And likewise, a critical attitude, an analytical attitude, we might also say, rather than an imaginative or an associative attitude, attempting to break down the phenomena into constituent elements rather than, in the fashion of a poet, to make metaphorical associations or connections. So this goes along with item number 2, which is natural explanations to natural phenomena. And we might also add, or an alternative formulation would be to say that the explanations here are immanent explanations. That is to say that we explain what happens in nature by appeal to nature, not by appeal to something that is beyond nature or transcending nature. So if we explain the earthquake in terms of the rains that saturated the soil, however erroneous that explanation might be, we're still explaining what happens in nature, namely an earthquake, by appeal to something else that happens in nature, namely rain. We're not saying that the earthquake was caused by something that transcends nature, and an angry god who caused the earthquake. So that's the second. And so we're getting away from anthropomorphic explanations that appeal to human-like motivations, to acts of will and choice and desire and human passions such as anger and lust and so forth, which is what you find in Hesiod and Homer. Third, authority is observational. Authority is observational. Or we might say nowadays empirical. So whereas Hesiod is going to appeal to the goddesses, to the muses for authority, and the highest claim is going to be a claim of divine revelation, where the poet in this case stands in as a kind of intermediary between humans and the gods. For the pre-Socratics, the appeal is to things that can be observed. So authority is observational as opposed to an appeal to divine revelation. And here we see, of course, the beginnings of the scientific method of inquiry. Okay, so this is basically the distinctive features that we find in pre-Socratic philosophy that distinguishes it as philosophy as opposed to poetry or mythology or religion. Now we have a handicap in studying the pre-Socratic philosophers. Namely, no pre-Socratic book has survived intact. So most of what we know about them, we know from what other sources said. And this is going to be necessarily fragmentary in nature. Because of the fragmentary form, there's always been a kind of fascinating enigma or enigmatic quality that surrounded the pre-Socratic philosophers. There's always a temptation to speculate about how the complete work would have looked if we could have seen it, to speculate about what they really meant in these oftentimes rather elusive statements. So the sources that we have, you can read about them again in this book on pages 5 through 7. I won't go through those. Other than to note generally that their reliability can't always be taken at face value, especially when the sources use the authors for polemical purposes. So when you have, for example, remarks about a pre-Socratic philosopher by a bishop who's writing a book called Against All the Heresies, you can take for granted that this person isn't necessarily going to have an unbiased lens through which he's viewing these philosophers. And this is especially the case with some of the most famous accounts and the most important accounts in many ways, which come to us from the most important Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, because oftentimes they are precisely defining their views against what they understood the pre-Socratic philosophers to be saying. And so there's a particular tendency, I think, to misread the philosophers, to cast them in the worst possible light so as to accentuate the plausibility of your own view. So we always have to keep that in mind. But we have what we have, and so we can't really get around that. Okay. So let's talk about our first group of philosophers, who are the Milesians. And the first of these is Thales. The Milesians, so-called because they were from Miletus, which is a city in what used to be called Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. And these philosophers formed a school in the sense that Thales, the founder, taught Anaximander, the next member of the group, and Anaximander, in turn, was the teacher of Anaximenes. So you have this kind of line of influence, which is a genuine school, a literal school. And this is interesting because it allows us to see a kind of dialogue and development of the house doctrine, so to speak, of the Milesians, where you can see definite influence on Anaximander, for example, of Thales, and of Anaximenes by Anaximander, but also a kind of a critical relationship. And so this is something that is distinctively philosophical. You don't have just the passing on of reverently and piously of a kind of received tradition. You do see elements of that in some of the other pre-Socratic schools, particularly the Pythagoreans, which we'll talk about next after the Milesians. But here, there definitely is a critical reception of the students, of the teacher's work by the student. Okay, so first of all, Thales. Thales was one of the 7 sages, Greek men regarded as legendary for their wisdom. He's reputed to have written nothing. Most information we have about him is in the form of oral tradition about his sayings and opinions that was handed down from very early on. This is regarded as mere oral tradition, not as quoting from something he wrote. And of course, like with all the 7 sages, we have legends about his life. We see he had a reputation for impracticality in the very first of our fragments here from Plato's Theaetetus, which is worth quoting just for fun. This is page 7, number 1. They say that when Thales was gazing upwards while doing astronomy, he fell into a well, and that a witty and charming Thracian serving girl made fun of him for being eager to know the things in the heavens, but failing to notice what was just behind him and right by his feet. Which is a rather philosophical remark from the Thracian servant girl. She perhaps should get some credit for being one of the earliest women philosophers, or girl, I guess, as she's described here, first female philosopher. But anyway, he had this reputation for impracticality. He was reputedly a mathematician and an astronomer, and he was said to have successfully predicted an eclipse, as I mentioned earlier. But there are 3 metaphysical or scientific views that are attributed to him by Aristotle. So the first of these is what we might call panpsychism. Panpsychism. And this is the view that the soul is mixed in with the whole of the universe, and that the soul is productive of motion in things. So we see in number 5, page 8, this is a quote from Aristotle's De Anima. Some say the soul is mixed in with the whole universe, and perhaps this is why Thales supposed that all things are full of gods. All things are full of gods. From what is related about him, it seems that Thales too held that the soul is something productive of motion. If indeed he said that the lodestone has a soul because it moves iron. This can be seen as a transitional position between the mythical and the scientific views of the universe. And of course, we naturally tend to regard it as something rather superstitious, that the lodestone has a soul. But actually, panpsychism is making a comeback today in philosophy, in the work of figures, for example, like Galen Strawson, because of something that was noted by Bertrand Russell influentially in the 20th century about the character of modern science, and in particular if we think about physics. Physics describes only relations. It doesn't tell us anything about the intrinsic character of anything. What's the inner nature of matter? Actually, philosophers from Aristotle to Locke have recognized a problem with distinguishing matter, pure matter, from nothingness. If we distinguish matter in itself from its properties or its behavior, which it seems necessary to do, although some philosophers have tried to get away with erasing that distinction, but if we distinguish matter, material, physical stuff in itself from the properties of physical stuff or the properties of matter, it seems like we're left with a kind of absolutely indeterminate thing that we don't know what it is intrinsically. By contrast, it does seem like we have some kind of inner knowledge of consciousness or the mental or the soul, if you will, to use the more old-fashioned term. And so it actually is even argued today that we have some reason to think of the intrinsic character of things as being full of gods in Thales' sense, in the sense that it contains a kind of soul-like character. So that's something that actually has arguably aged pretty well. Second, in addition to this, Thales is assigned the view that there's a principle of all things which is material. And these are really two distinct points that it's worth dwelling a bit upon separately. First, the idea that there's a principle of all things. That is, that there's some one thing that everything is constituted by. One might argue that Thales invented reductionism. Reductionism. Reductionism, I don't know if you can read that, is the view that many diverse types of phenomena can be reduced to a single type. That the differences between things and their apparently diverse explanations can be reduced to a single explanation. We find a good description of this in Aristotle's Metaphysics that's quoted here. When I quote this whole passage, this is number 3. Of those who first pursued philosophy, the majority believed, and of course this begins with Thales, so Thales is the originator of this, the majority believed that the only principles of things are principles in the form of matter. For that of which all existing things are composed, and that from which they originated, originally come to be, and that into which they finally perish, the substance persisting but changing in its attributes, it's a complex sentence, this, they state, is the element and principle of the things that are. In other words, there is some one principle out of which everything develops and everything ultimately decays and comes back to that one principle. And Aristotle already says here that they believe this was a material principle. We're leaving that aside as a kind of a separate point, another significant revolutionary change in conception. But the very idea that there's one type of thing into which all diverse phenomena can be resolved, that all of the phenomena that we see in the world come out of this one principle and they all come back to it. This is now, of course, a commonplace. It's common to think of science as aiming at reductionism in this way, simplification of the phenomena of the world so as to better understand it, explain it, and ultimately grasp it and control it. So it's commonplace now to think of science in this way. But we might pause for a moment to appreciate the genius of insight that it took to look at all the diversity. Think about all the diversity of the natural phenomena that we're acquainted with, and all the variety in nature, and to speculate that all that might be one thing. That had to seem like quite a radical and even absurd notion at the beginning. And the second part that's mentioned here in this quote from Aristotle was equally revolutionary. That the one principle was a material principle. There was no free will or choice of a God that was involved. So the explanation was accessible to us, something we can hold and touch and handle, like water, which is what Thales said. According to Aristotle, the same passage, Thales, the founder of this kind of philosophy, stated it to be water. Why? Aristotle speculates he may have gotten this idea from seeing that the nourishment of all things is moist, and that even the hot itself comes to be from this and lives on this. The principle of all things is that from which they come to be. Getting this idea from this consideration is also because the seeds of all things have a moist nature, and water is the principle of the nature of moist things. So we see here the observational method being pursued. We notice that all things seem, certainly living things, require nourishment, and their nourishment is moist, and moistness comes from water. So this suggests that water is somehow underlying all things in this way. Likewise, the seeds of all things seem to germinate and to grow only in water or in moisture. So you can see here, of course, the inadequacy of the explanation from a modern perspective really requires no comment. But what's important for our purposes is the methodology that we take for granted in modern science is here being discovered for the first time, this observational kind of perspective. And of course, human beings have had a kind of rough technical observational method that they've used to get along with their, to get on with their lives. To get along in the world. But what makes us distinctive and philosophical and more scientific is the generality with which this observational method is being applied. So Thales is not just saying, hey, I noticed that this method of farming is more effective than this method of farming. What he's saying is that everything ultimately is made up of water. And so we're trying to have the broadest possible scope of our explanation based upon observations. That's what's new. That's what's radical and revolutionary and creates something that is distinct from poetry and mythology. Okay, so that's Thales. Now we move on to the next individual, who is Anaximander. But before we do that, I want to raise a first discussion question for this lecture. And that is, what, in your view, are the most important differences between a mythological or a religious explanation of natural phenomena, on the one hand, and a philosophical, scientific, or proto-scientific explanation, such as the one Thales provides? What are the important differences between the myth of, say, a Hesiod or Homer on the one hand, and the philosophy of a Thales on the other? What are the important differences that make those two distinct things? What do you think led Thales to abandon the myths of Hesiod and Homer and strike out in a new direction intellectually? What does one get? What benefits does one get from the poetic mythological and the scientific philosophical forms of explanation? What different types of benefits does one get from the poetic mythological on the one hand and the philosophical scientific type of explanation on the other hand? What, if anything, are the different benefits that are achieved? What is gained and what is lost by the shift from mythology to philosophy? So this is our first discussion question. What, in your view, are the most important differences between a mythological or religious explanation of natural phenomena and a philosophical, scientific, or proto-scientific explanation such as Thales provides? What do you think led Thales to abandon the myths of Hesiod and Homer and strike out in a new direction intellectually? What does one get? What benefits from the poetic, mythological, and the philosophical, scientific forms of explanation? What, if anything, are the different benefits that are achieved? What is gained and what is lost? So that's the first discussion question. Okay. On to Anaximander, who was an early astronomer, cartographer, mapmaker, and a geologist who was good at predicting earthquakes, apparently. And the center of his philosophy is a mysterious notion called the Epeiron. And this has been given various possible translations: the boundless, the limitless, the indefinite, and probably most popular, the infinite. That's the Epeiron. So this can be translated in these various ways. We read in Simplicius, here, this is number 1, page 9. Of those who declared that the arche, this is the principle, the fundamental principle of things, which for Thales was water. Of those who declared that the arche is one moving and Epeiron, Anaximander said that the Epeiron was the archean element of things that are, and he was the first to introduce this name for the arche. That is, he was the first to call the arche Epeiron. In addition, he said that motion is eternal, in which it occurs that the heavens come to be. He said that the arche is neither water nor any of the other things called elements, but some other nature, which is Epeiron, out of which come to be all the heavens and the worlds in them. The things that perish into the things from which they come to be, according to necessity, for which they pay penalty and retribution to each other for their injustice in accordance with the ordering of time, as he says in rather poetical language. So one question we might ask is, how did the student of Thales, who says that the arche, or the principle of all things, is water, which is of course something very concrete and material, how might he derive this concept that the principle of all things is, let's call it, the infinite? Well, perhaps this way. He might derive this concept by taking inspiration from the fact that the water, which of course paradigmatically occurs in the sea, and also the sky, which is often seen in the ancient world as another sea, the sea below and the sea above, so to speak, by taking inspiration from the way that these things appear to us, which is as something that is indeed, for all intents and purposes, infinite. The sea doesn't appear to have an end. The sky doesn't appear to have an end. Their characteristic phenomenal appearance to us is as something that is boundless, limitless. And what we find here is a proposal about the relationship between the universal, the whole, the totality, and the particular things. The universal principle of all things is boundless. Out of this, particular things emerge and are submerged like waves in the ocean. And here, once again, we see the residue of a mythological way of thinking as well, when Anaximander asks why particular things perish and are reabsorbed into the infinite, and his answer is injustice. They pay penalty and retribution. The idea seems to be that existing as an individual is a violation of the rights of the infinite. It's almost as if it's, for me to be an individual, to have an individual particular existence, is stealing a part of the rightful constituents of the infinite. Because, of course, the infinite includes everything. It's constituted by absolutely everything. So for me to exist as a particular is kind of a violation of the right of the infinite to my particular constituents, which are really its particular constituents, or part of it. Consequently, a penalty must be paid. And this penalty is reabsorption into the infinite. Now, there's more complexity to this story. He talks about something which gives birth to heat and cold. So hot and cold have a kind of intermediate role to play in his story about how particular things emerge from the infinite. So it's not that they emerge from the infinite directly, but they emerge only through some medium, some intermediate agency or power, which produces hot and cold, he says. This is number 3. He declares that what arose from the eternal and is productive of or capable of giving birth to hot and cold was separated off at the coming to be of this cosmos. And a kind of sphere of flame from this grew around the dark mist about the earth like a bark about a tree. When it was broken off and enclosed in certain circles, the sun, moon, and stars came to be. And we see still in Anaximander this characteristic sort of emphasis on material, natural explanations for things. So he's trying to explain sort of how the sun and the moon and the stars came to be in natural terms without appealing to gods. But behind this, at the ultimate level of the principle, the arche of all things, is the infinite, the boundless. Still. Also, there's a principle of change or motion. And number 2 here, this is described as an eternal principle of motion. Motion is eternal. So what is this eternal principle of motion? It seems like it's a separate principle. So you have the infinite, the boundless, but logically speaking, there's no logical requirement that the infinite or the boundless has to move or contain motion within itself. So Anaximander posits, in addition, this principle of motion. Everything is in eternal motion. And this, again, seems to be a continuation and reflection of Thales' view that everything is water, because water seems to be something that's has a constant tendency to be in motion. And so there needs to be a principle of motion added in addition to this apeiron here that we need to add to it. So we've got motion as another principle, which it's worth noting is left unaccounted for. So this principle of motion is kind of a freestanding thing. It's not some particular type of motion. For example, it's not a process of thickening or thinning, as when water, thickens into ice or thins into vapor. It's just a principle of motion as such. We might ask, why did Anaximander break with Thales' teaching in the first place? And here, of course, we have to sort of speculate a little bit, but we can imagine him arguing with his venerable teacher in something like this way. And I won't write this now. I'll speak it out slowly and repeat it if you want to take it down and mull it over. So this is my speculative reconstruction of what perhaps Anaximander might have been thinking when he was reflecting upon Thales' theory. Premise 1. There can be no becoming without there being something that becomes. There can be no becoming without there being something that becomes. Premise 2. Everything limited comes into being and perishes. Everything limited comes into being and perishes. Premise 3. The something that becomes, that is to say being, therefore must be unlimited. If everything limited comes into being and perishes, then the something that becomes, that underlies all coming into being, must be unlimited. So once again, the line of reasoning is this. 1, there can be no becoming without there being something that becomes. Everything limited comes into being and perishes. Being, the something that becomes, therefore must be unlimited. A problem arises, though, with this very notion of the unlimited. It would seem that in order to even talk intelligibly about something, we have to draw a limit in a definition, typically, to limit the thing, at least conceptually, or to speak of a limited part of something. But then how can we speak intelligibly of the unlimited? Typically, in other words, we make sense of something by saying, well, it's this as opposed to that. Thales posited that water was the principle of all things. Water as opposed to, say, fire or air. But that's to draw a limit, to make water into something limited. Anaximander, as I've just suggested, perhaps took exception to this and said, no, the being that underlies all change has to be something unlimited. But then, how can we even speak about this unlimited? How can we even make sense of this? Doesn't this become a kind of nonsensical notion? What is the unlimited? What distinguishes the unlimited from nothing? Nothingness. That's the word. Okay, second discussion question then. Is Anaximander right to speak of the unlimited as the principle of all reality? Are there any good reasons or arguments for his position? Can we speak intelligibly of the unlimited? Why or why not? So once again, second discussion question. Is Anaximander right to speak of the unlimited as the principle of all reality? Are there any good reasons or arguments for his position? Can we speak intelligibly of the unlimited? Why or why not? All right, so that brings us to Anaximander, our third of the Milesians, who was a student of Anaximander. And he was a throwback to Thales in affirming a material principle, namely air. There's the Greek air, which is usually translated as air, but as the editors point out, it's probably better thought of as something like a dense mist. And here you see more of the influence of Thales, because when you have a dense mist, you have something that's closer to the master's principle, namely water. So in a way, Anaximander is going back to Thales. But like his teacher, like Anaximander, Anaximander regarded this first principle as still being unlimited. Also, as you see in several quotes here, Anaximander provided an explanation of the process of change that's left unexplained by his teacher. Namely, it's a form of thickening and thinning. Change is condensation and rarefaction of air. So the principle of change is in the thickening or thinning of this air. As we see here in the first quote, page 10, Anaximander, like Anaximander, declares that the underlying nature is one and unlimited, but not indeterminate, as Anaximander held, but definite, saying that it is air. So we're getting away from the problems of the indeterminacy of the unlimited and saying it's air. It differs in rarity and density according to the substances it becomes. Becoming finer, it comes to be fire. Being condensed, it comes to be wind and cloud. And when still further condensed, it becomes water. Then, when it's further condensed, earth, then stones, and the rest come to be from these. He also makes motion eternal and says that change also comes to be through it. So Anaximander preserves Anaximander's idea that there's this eternal principle of motion that belongs to the principle of all things, but Anaximander makes this more internal to the principle because he sees the principle as air or the dense mist, and the principle of change just concerns this natural thickening and thinning that air has. There's also the view here, number 2, just as our soul, being air, holds us together and controls us, so do breath and air surround the whole cosmos. Again, we have a kind of ingenious idea. He seems to be arguing something like this, or thinking along these lines. Premise 1, soul holds the human body together and controls it. This is a very common ancient conception of the soul. The soul is whatever principle holds our bodies together so that our bodies don't become corpses. That's what the soul is. And this also controls the body, because the soul is associated with the mental processes that allow the body to be controlled, but also the automatic processes that allow the organs to function as organs, as opposed to just pieces of meat. So that's the first premise. The soul holds the human body together and controls it. Premise 2, soul is air or spirit-like. The soul is traditionally associated with the air in the lungs, without which, of course, one dies. Examples of this can be found in Homer. Air leaving the lungs is equated with the soul leaving the body. By extension, air holds together the body of the universe and controls it. So that seems to be the idea, that there's something like a soul of the universe, which is the air. Also, like his teacher, he affirmed the constancy and eternity of the motion of the air. Air is always moving and changing. In fact, for him, you might say that the observed change in motion of the air is a reason for asserting the eternity of change. Air is constantly in motion. So number 3, Anaximander determined that air is a god, and that it comes to be and is without measure, infinite, and always in motion. Next passage, number 4, skipping down there. It is always moving, for all the things that undergo change would not change if they were not moving. So then he goes on to describe the ways in which it moves. All right, so that's the Milesians, Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes. And you can see how I think they form a genuine school of philosophers, a progression and a dialogue with one another. All right, so this brings us to the next group. The Pythagoreans. The Pythagoreans. Of course, named after their great leader and founder, Pythagoras. And probably the idea, this is sort of paraphrasing here, but the idea that they're most commonly associated with is reality is number. Being the principle of reality is number. And this is something that you see probably most clearly stated in Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is number 14, pages 14 through 15. At the same time, these, namely Leucippus and Democritus, and before them those called Pythagoreans, took hold of mathematics and were the first to advance that study. And being brought up in it, they believed that its principles are the principles of all things that are. They believed that its principles, that the principles of mathematics, are the principles of all things that are. Since numbers are naturally first among these, and in numbers they thought they observed many resemblances to things that are and that come to be, and since they saw the attributes and ratios of musical scales in numbers, and other things seem to be made in the likeness of numbers in their entire nature, and numbers seem to be primary in all nature, they supposed the elements of numbers to be the elements of all things that are. The elements of numbers to be the elements of all things that are. Aristotle here doesn't quite say reality is number. He says the elements of number are also the elements of reality. But what does that mean, the elements of number? Well, this is something that's subject to interpretation, very mysterious. Different interpretations are possible. One would be that literally numbers are all there is, and everything else besides numbers is an illusion. That would be one view. Numbers, there's only numbers, everything else is an illusion. Nothing else exists. Another would be that everything is reducible. Remember, reductionism, right? The basic idea of saying that there's some one principle. That seems to fit here, that everything's somehow reducible to numbers. That numbers, in this case, would be something like the fundamental particles that make up things. And later on, we'll talk about the views of Leucippus and Democritus, which is the view of ancient atomism. So Aristotle's mention of them in the same breath as Pythagoras suggests that kind of reductionistic idea, that somehow everything is reducible to numbers. Another would be a kind of proto-Platonic view, as we'll see later. Plato holds the view that appearances in the natural world are merely reflections or shadows of some other reality that's only known through the mind. And Plato was in many ways influenced by the Pythagoreans, so we might think that was a Pythagorean view, that appearances are something like reflections or shadows of numbers. The problem is all three of these interpretations, that numbers are all there are, everything else is an illusion, everything is somehow reducible to numbers as if numbers were the atomic elements of things, or the proto-Platonic view that appearances are merely reflections or shadows of numbers. All these views are very difficult to make sense of. So it's tempting to extend the sense of reality as number a bit and to take it to mean something like everything apparently qualitative is really quantitative. Or the qualitative is really at the fundamental level quantitative. And we'll put a question mark after this, since this is just a suggestion, proposal. Reality is number. Could that mean that the qualitative is really merely quantitative? So this is a kind of reductionism, but it's a way of saying that underlying the qualitative differences between things are really quantitative relations. And this brings, of course, the Pythagorean view much closer to, let's say, modern theories of things like color or light or sound, which contained qualitative character to us in the way we experience them, but that, of course, are understood scientifically in terms of quantitative relations, ratios, proportions, and so forth. What are the arguments for this proposition? One that seems to be alluded to here in this passage from Aristotle is that people have observed that the discovery of acoustics seems to strongly suggest this principle that the qualitative is really the quantitative. That qualitative tonal differences really are just quantitative differences in specific numerical relationships. So there's a kind of correspondence between the tone of a certain pitch to the string of a certain length. Now, this idea of there being something like a music that is at the base of reality, but this music is understood not in terms of qualitative music, the way it sounds pleasing to the ear, but in terms of what we might describe as quantitative music, or the actual numerical relations that underlie the sound. This idea goes along with an elevation of harmony to the status of a universal cosmological principle. And that's what you find. You find this illustrated very nicely in number 13 there. The tetactris is a certain number, which being composed of the four first numbers produces the most perfect number 10. For 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, that is 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4, come to be 10. This number is the first tetactris and is called the source of ever-flowing nature. So this progression, 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 equals 10, is called the source of nature. Very difficult to get the handle on it. But why? Well, because the entire cosmos is organized according to harmony. And harmonia is a system of three concords, the fourth, the fifth, and the octave. and the proportions of these three concords are found in the aforementioned four numbers. So the idea is that there seems to be a kind of harmony in terms of these proportions that are referred to here, these musical proportions that is somehow pervading the universe. That's this Pythagorean idea. So you can see the line of thought that might lead one to this conclusion. Again, it's sort of similar to the way Anaximander would think about the soul as being the unifying principle of air in the lungs that unifies the body, holds it together. In the case of music, harmony is what binds tones together in a musical work and produces a kind of unity rather than just cacophony of noise. Right? If you don't have harmony, you just have a kind of a cacophony of opposing sounds. But the harmony binds or unites the tones together in a musical work. And so by analogy, there's a kind of analogous harmony that binds or unites the phenomena of the universe. And this is an idea that had a lot of resonance throughout the history of Western civilization, and it contains overtones of a kind of religious idea. Incidentally, I'll just mention it here without commenting on it because it doesn't seem to me to have as much distinctively philosophical content. The Pythagoreans also were associated with a kind of religious sensibility that was centered around the transmigration of souls, which Pythagoras is credited with introducing into the West. Of course, this has a long history in the East, in Eastern religion and philosophy, but this was a distinctive Pythagorean doctrine in the West. So there was also this religious kind of character to the Pythagorean school that distinguished it from the Milesian school. And you can read more about that in the text, so I won't belabor that point too much. Okay, the third discussion question. How do you think we can make the best sense of the Pythagoreans' view that reality is number? Is there any truth to this view? How does it relate to the apparent fact that science progresses most rapidly when it reduces phenomena to mathematical formulae? Why do you think mathematics is so effective as a tool for explaining the natural world? After all, math seems to be something that humans construct in their heads, which the natural world shouldn't necessarily be responsive to. So why does nature seem to correspond to mathematical constructs? Can the Pythagorean principle explain this? All right, so third discussion question. How do you think we can make best sense of the Pythagorean view that reality is number? And what is the truth of this view in your view? How does this relate to the progress of science and the ability of science to progress more quickly through the employment of mathematics? Why is it that math seems to apply to the natural universe? And do the Pythagoreans have a good way of explaining that through this metaphysical view that really reality is fundamentally mathematical? So I'd like you to think about those questions. All right, so finally, a solitary figure, Xenophanes of Colophon. And here again, as with these other schools that we've talked about today, we see materialistic theories, naturalistic explanations of things, theories about the formation of the sun from many individual fires and so on. And so I merely note that as something that marks Xenophanes out as the proto-scientific pre-Socratic philosopher that he was. But the thing that seems to distinguish him most interestingly from a purely philosophical perspective, in the contemporary sense of philosophical, is his view of the gods, or more exactly of God. That in Xenophanes we see quite clearly God coming into the picture as more of a philosophical concept. We get a kind of philosopher's God, as it would be known. Later on, this would come to be known as deism, as opposed to theism, but it would be anachronistic to attribute deism to Xenophanes, but we begin to see maybe a kind of proto-deism, the idea of a philosopher's God, as opposed to, let's say, a priest's God or a pious religious person's God, where God comes to be just a kind of philosophical principle, kind of quasi-scientific principle. So the distinction here between theism and deism, with theism, we understand that God is concerned from the dawn of humanity to the present day with the lives of human beings. And that's something you see, for example, in the Bible, that conception of God. Whereas deism would just say that, well, God originated the universe, but now is either unconcerned with it or is merely kind of a supervisor. Right? God is sort of like Homer Simpson, who's got his job supervising in the nuclear power plant and doesn't really do anything there except take a nap all day. That's the idea. God is just a kind of uninvolved supervisor at best, a kind of absent God that's not concerned with intervening in a particular way. Now, the particular flavor that Xenophanes gives this is he's a critic of anthropomorphic conceptions of gods. So we see a string of these sorts of remarks on page 17, where he's a critic of Homer and Hesiod, who, as in number 6 there, ascribe to the god all deeds with among men or matters of reproach and blame, thieving, adultery, and deceiving one another. Continuing down the list there, as they sang of many illicit acts of the gods, thieving, adultery, and deceiving one another. But mortals suppose that the gods are born, have human clothing, and voice and bodily form. If horses had hands, or oxen, or lions, or they could draw with their hands and produce work as men's do, then horses would draw figures of gods like horses, and oxen like oxen, and each would render the bodies to be the same frame that each of them have. Ethiopians say that their gods are snub-nosed and dark, Thracians that theirs are gray-eyed and red-haired. So Xenophanes is criticizing this anthropomorphic conception of the divine, thinking of the gods as if they had a human form. Instead, for him, God is, it's not really clear, but it seems like he has the view that perhaps he believes in the pantheon of Greek gods, traditional gods of Olympus, but then above all of these gods, there's an absolute God. There's an ultimate God, a higher God, who is just pure spirit. Number 12, still on page 17, one God, greatest among gods and men, not at all like mortals in form and thought. Whole he sees, whole he thinks, and whole he hears. It's not really clear whether he's saying there that this God doesn't have a body or that this God is omniscient or is part of the whole. Not the God of lightning as opposed to the God of the sea. That kind of idea. And it doesn't have a particular province, but concerns the whole. Always he remains in the same state, changing not at all, nor is it fitting that he come and go in different places at different times, but he completely without toil agitates all things by the will of his mind. By the will of his mind. So this God is a kind of spiritual principle that perhaps, animates all things, but if you combine this with the kinds of explanations that Xenophanes tried to give to things, it's not that this God is constantly intervening with a kind of arbitrary will, like a petty tyrant. Rather, this God, the will that this God has, that he acts through his mind, is merely something like the law of nature itself, the material laws of nature, as we would say in a modern sense. So, along with this, Xenophanes there says, number 23, page 18, and of course the clear and certain truth no man has seen, nor will there be anyone who knows about the gods and what I say about all things, for even if in the best case someone happened to speak about what has been brought to pass, nevertheless he himself would not know, but opinion is ordained for all. That is, what's that saying there is that there's no special revelation from the gods. The only thing we know, as we said at the beginning, is what we can know through observation of how the natural universe appears to behave, and the theories that we can construct are always going to be merely opinions. There is no special access to the muses as Homer and Hesiod thought, but opinion is ordained for all. That's Xenophanes.